All right, for starters, I've counted everybody here, so I expect the same number of people seated when I'm done here today. So you might ask, why am I up here today? Well, Brian asked me a few weeks back to fill in for a week, so I couldn't say no, right? The theology program, I see a bunch of our theology peeps in here. If it wasn't for the theology program, we've been through the intro course, the bibliography and hermeneutics and Trinitarianism. I don't think I would feel comfortable standing up here. And the encouragement of my wife. So once I accepted this opportunity, I asked Brian, I said, do you need to give me a topic to speak on? He said, no. I said, do you need to approve and see what I'm going to say when I'm up there? He said, no. So the takeaway is, should any of you leave the Oaks because of something I say today? No. If you don't agree with something I say today, come see me, and not a reason to leave the Oaks. But I don't think that's going to be a problem here today. We're not talking about sex and marriage like Brian covered in Corinthians. It's a much simpler topic today as we're going to get into the book of Daniel. So you might ask, why did I pick the book of Daniel? So to be clear, I'm not Brian Cole. I can't speak for 45 minutes on two chapters or two verses in the Bible. So we're going to be covering 3 chapters in the book of Daniel with the hope that maybe as homework, it's a short book, you can go back and dig into the book of Daniel yourself when you get back home. So why did I pick Daniel? I recently reread the book of Daniel, and somehow I had a little bit of a connection with Daniel, him being in exile. My family and I had the opportunity to live in China for a year, and I lived in Iraq for a year while deployed with the Army. So in both cases, I had the opportunity to deal with things like assimilation, culture shock, food, living conditions, being away from the family. Because of this, I felt a connection in some small way with Daniel and what he experienced living in a foreign land. Also, while reading Daniel, I finally had a connection to understand the Bible's obsession with Babylon, and what it represents. And we're going to cover that a little bit more today. And Terry kind of hit on that a little bit before. The Spirit is out there. So a little bit of background, because of course I have to follow Brian's model here, right? We got to do a little historical background before we get in. I do not ride a motorcycle. I have a license, so we won't be putting the kickstand up and down today like Brian does. But I think we'll get it anyways. So, and you said to be patient here, Mark. There we go. So just as a little reference, so the Babylonian Empire, as we see on the map, at the height of their power, this was the area that Babylon geographically covered. On the right-hand side, you can see Babylon itself. Babylon is in current-day Iraq, about 50 miles south of Baghdad on the Euphrates River. It's the same area that I served in when I was in Iraq. I lived about 30 miles away from this area and would often fly right over the top of it en route to Baghdad or other forwarding operating bases. So that was another connection that I had. I wasn't there at a time where I could just get in a car and go do sightseeing of the old Babylon. It wasn't, quite the time. Maybe someday head back over there. So when we look at Babylon in the Bible, I think we see 2 things. We see the Babylonian Empire and the city itself. And this is the same area that the Judeans were sent to in exile that we're going to see later in the book of Daniel. It's also referenced in both the first and the last books of the Bible. In Genesis and Revelation, we talk about Babylon. It's where the Garden of Eden supposedly was. It's where the hanging gardens that King Nebuchadnezzar built for his wife because she missed the green hills and valleys of the homeland. I kind of wondered if this is why we have to give our wives flowers now, because this guy went ahead and built this whole garden. I'm not exactly sure, but maybe that's the origin of it. This is also the region where Abraham was called from. He lived in Ur. You can see on the map there on the right-hand side. You can read that in Genesis 12, verse 1. Babylon is mentioned over 260 times in the Bible, second only to Jerusalem. So that kind of covers Babylon, the city. But there's the other piece that was the final revelation for me as I was reading the book of Daniel, it's Babylon, the spirit. Babylon represents the battle between God and evil, between true religion and the false religion. Jerusalem is God's city. Babylon is the devil's city. Everything God tries to do, the city of Babylon counters. It's between the bride and the mother of prostitutes, as we read about in Revelation, about when they talk about Babylon. It reminded me a little bit of The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Sacrifice and resurrection are the central themes of that story as the characters undergo personal transformations and make significant sacrifices for the greater good. The story begins with, does anyone remember? The best of times, the worst of times. I read that, I think, Jerusalem and Babylon. Best of times, the worst of times. Babylon is a result of the apostasy against God's plan of salvation. Babylon was the location of the first political, international religious movement in the history of man. Does anybody remember what happened in the city of Babylon? Tower of Babel, correct. As the first king of Babylon, Nimrod, I always love that name, he was a rebel from the beginning to the end. He had within him the nature and the character that would exist in the Gentile nations throughout history, and especially in the final form to come in the tribulation, tyranny and apostasy. He decided to build a city and a tower to reach the heavens. Why? The purpose was to make a name in defiance of God's plan, one which has never ceased to exist in one form or another to today. God's call to Abraham was further a calling to separate himself from the corruption and idolatry around him and his family in Babylon, his town of Ur, and to separate himself to the living God, as we read in 2 Corinthians 6. Abraham was being asked to forsake everything to follow God's call. You're 75 years old, you're in the prime of your life, you got a good job, a nice nest egg, a home you like, friends you admire, neighbors you respect, you're an upstanding, valuable part of the community, you've got a good future ahead of you, the last thing you want to do is move. And now God, whom you just met, wants you to leave everything, your family, your friends, your country, your home, your business, your security. What would you do? He did not know where he was going, into a foreign land. He went by faith. Isn't it ironic that God pulled the descendants of Abraham out of the corrupt Babylon, called Shinar in the book of Genesis, to create a nation of Israel, and many, many years later, after all their sinning and failure to repent, he sends them right back in exile to the place that they started. So you may ask, how evil was Babylon? Well, Babylon was evil enough that they got their own album. So the Rolling Stones album, The Road to Babylon, just look at the name of some of the songs on that album there. That gives you an idea of how evil Babylon was. Now this next line, we're not going to go into great detail. What I really want you to get here as a takeaway is look at everything that we're going to discuss today in Daniel. It was foretold by Israel to Israel and Judah by several prophets, and Israel and Judah failed to listen and heed their warnings. You can see on the slide here all of the prophets that spoke to those kings and people in both Israel and Judah. You have to remember, at this time, it was a divided kingdom. Israel in the north and Judah to the south. So the Assyrians advanced against Israel. The destruction of Israel is documented in the Bible, specifically in the book of 2 Kings 17, and also described by Isaiah in chapter 10. In 722 BC, after a 3-year siege against all of the major cities as shown on this slide, the ruling city of the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria, fell to King Sargon II, marking the end of Israel's independence. He tried to take Jerusalem multiple times, but the time had not come according to God's plan. Many Israelites were forcibly relocated by the Syrians, and the region was settled with deportees from other conquered territories. Does anyone remember the name that we give to the people or the victims of this displacement from Israel? Bueller? They're often referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Do not be mistaken, this was all part of God's plan, as the prophets foretold, and under his sovereign control, Israel was given to the Assyrians. This left the kingdom of Judah as the sole Israelite kingdom until the final Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 587, which led to the final Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people. But do not fear, the evil Assyrians did not prevail. God had a different plan. In 616 BC, the Chaldeans under Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon for the past 10 years, invaded Assyria. In the following year, the Medes invaded Assyria, and here the Medes and the Babylonians actually agreed to act in unison in 614, and after a year of slow campaigning, they besieged the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, in 612 BC. After 3 months, the great city fell and was destroyed, thus starting the rise of the Babylonian Empire. The huge Assyrian Empire was divided amongst the Babylonians. The Medes, Nabopolassar, held most of Mesopotamia, that is Babylonia and Assyria, and claimed Syria and Palestine. Nebuchadnezzar initiated his first attack on Jerusalem, as we'll see shortly, and took his first captives in 605 BC, which included Daniel. He had to hurry back to Babylon to claim the throne because of his father's death. Now, before we get into the book of Daniel, quick overview. Mark told me patience here. There we go. So, who is the author of Daniel? Daniel, supposedly. We'll get into that in a minute. Its genre is prophecy and apocalyptic. It was written while he was in exile in Babylon. It was written to Jews in exile and those back in Judah. Interesting that chapters 1 and 8 and 12 were written in Hebrew, and 2 and 7 were written in Aramaic. It's kind of reminiscent of when you watch some movies and they do flashbacks in a foreign language. So it was written for two different people in two different places, those still in Jerusalem and those currently in exile in Babylon, because remember, it took 3 sieges. 605 to 535 BC. The main theme of this book is the sovereignty of God and the future redemption of the Jewish people. There are debates if Daniel was even the author of this book, if he really existed, and if there really was a Babylonian exile of the Israelites. As we read in Matthew 24:15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Jesus here is referring to the prophet Daniel and the scripture he wrote. So I don't know about the rest of you. If he believes Daniel existed, I'm with him. For those that deny the exile ever happened and that the Bible is just a bunch of fictional stories, we can also refer to extra-biblical evidence and, of course, archaeological finds. The Jewish historian Josephus, Brian references as often, in his work Against Apion wrote, the king of Babylon and the Chaldeans, when he was relating the acts of this king, he described to us how he sent his son, Nebuchadnezzar, against Egypt and against our land with a great army, upon his being informed that they had revolted from him, and how by that means he subdued them all and set our temple that was in Jerusalem on fire, and removed our people entirely out of their own country, and transferred them to Babylon, when it has so happened that our city was desolate for an interval of 70 years until the day of King Cyrus, the king of Persia. So again, for those that want to think the Bible is all made up, there's archaeological finds that can prove it, and here we have Josephus, who seemed to be the most detailed person that probably ever walked the face of the earth. He seemed to write everything down. We can see right here. So let's cover 2 last important historical contexts before we set the stage for our reading of Daniel. So we learned just right there that they were in exile for 70 years. So why 70 years? You might ask, like I did. Why 70 years? Well, because of apostasy and idol worship. But more importantly, because of their failure to let the land rest as God had instructed them all the way back in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So God knew way back then that land needed to rest, just like smart farmers know today when you see them do rotational cropping. But we can read in Ezekiel 4, that's that weird story where he's told to lie on his side for a certain number of days. It spells out there the number of years that Israel and Judah failed to let their land rest. They were supposed to let it rest 1 year every 7 years and 1 year for every Jubilee year every 49 years. I'm not going to bother you with the math on a Monday. You can do it at home. But 430 years that they failed to let the land rest, you add those up, you're going to get 70 years. So as you see here, for the Judean exile, it was a long journey, 700 miles, that they had to go from Jerusalem to their new home in Babylon. You know, as I look at this and see the distance they went and having the opportunity to live in that sand place, trust me, America is a great place. I have no desire to go back there vacationing anytime soon, other than maybe to see some of these parts. But you know, I thought of their 700-mile journey to get there, and to me it was a little reminiscent of their ancestors wandering around the desert themselves. And again, here they are going back to the place they started, where Abraham came from. So they spent all that way. They built the great nation. They wandered the desert because they didn't follow. And now they get to march themselves all the way back to where they started. So let's get into it. Bibles are in the pews if you want to follow along. Everything will be on the slides here. So as we get into the book of Daniel, let's start with Daniel 1:1-5. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord delivered, so in good Brian fashion here, underline that if you're taking notes, the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put to the treasure of his God. Then the king ordered Aspenaz, the chief of the court officials, the chief of the eunuchs, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language, the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So let's look at a few things here. King Jehoiakim, he was a bad king. He was the son of the last good king, Josiah. As I said before, the important thing here is the Lord delivered Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. God was in control. He was carrying out his plan just as prophesied by the prophets and they foretold. And God warned about all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy. This was not because of the powerful Babylon. He carried off some of the contents of the temple and the treasures of to the treasure house of his God. So by this we know that Nebuchadnezzar was not only an enemy to Israel, but he was also an enemy to Israel's God. I can just picture them carrying off the treasures of the temple in the back of their chariots. I can just picture a bumper sticker saying, "My God is stronger than your God." We also notice there is the chief of the eunuchs. We'll get back to that in a minute, so remember that. So these captives were from the royal family. Young men, teenagers, probably 14 years old, without defect, handsome, smart, well-informed, quick to understand. Probably a good thing I wasn't there, or they would have taken me too. These young men grew up in a country that was on a moral decline for hundreds of years, yet, as we'll soon see, these young men were followers of God. They were victims of circumstances. This had to puzzle them. They were guilty by association. Or were they? As God was in sovereign control, he had a plan and a purpose for these young men. They saw their city attacked and much of the temple contents taken. They might have possibly seen their parents or others killed, just like the last king of Judah, King Zedekiah, saw his sons killed in front of him. And then they poked his eyes out. So the last thing he would remember was his sons being killed. And then he was put in chains and put into prison until he died. If you want to read that great story, go to Jeremiah 52. These teenage boys became POWs, or captives, in a foreign land with a foreign language and a foreign culture. They probably had to endure walking that 700 miles that I mentioned before to get there. And I'm fairly sure they didn't have Uber chariots back then either. At this point, in preparing my message and reflecting on their POW status, I found myself pulling out my unclassified U.S. Army manual that covers captivity, resistance, and escape. Because why not? Any good hermeneutics and bibliology should include an Army manual. So I looked in that manual, and I reviewed the stages of captivity for POWs that these young men would go through. It's 4 stages. Point of capture, Jerusalem. Movement stage, 700 miles, reminding me of the Bataan Death March. The long-term stage, 70 years. We already knew how long they were going to be in captivity. And their potential release or reintegration, 70 years later when they got released, they were able to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. As you read in the text, these young Judeans were to be trained in Babylon. They received a full-ride scholarship. to the University of Babylon. Maybe not that bad compared to being put to death. So they were about to undergo a 3-year training program, being given the chance to serve on the king's court. This is really an indoctrination program. They were going to get classes in language and literature and astrology and magical customs and public affairs and political science and military history, international relations, dream interpretations. These were all integral to the royal court and its politics. They were given free room and board and access to the king's table of food. Sounds pretty good to me. The spirit of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar is in action here with this indoctrination program. I would suggest that the spirit of Babylon is alive in America today and in many of our churches that are preaching a false doctrine and gospel message. We are all, especially our young generation, under attack via the media, the education system, the internet, homosexuality, fornication, pornography, drug use, abortion, all openly accepted and promoted, things that were not remotely acceptable only a few decades ago. Look at the indoctrination that is occurring in universities today, the perverse ideas and thoughts that are being put into their heads. Integrity, honesty, morality, patriotism, Christian life, the nuclear family, they're all under attack and mocked. Immorality is the new morality as we live in a postmodern world where everything is relative. Our young generation says it's okay if it doesn't hurt anybody else. In America, these young men and women have been indoctrinated at universities and are now coming into leadership roles in our country. This is just like the elite of Judea that were going to be put through the University of Babylon. Let's keep this in mind as we see the challenges presented and how these captors dealt with it. The story continues. Among those were chosen from Judea Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; and to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. To start with, let's realize these young men were probably teenagers, as I said before, 14 years old. Keep in mind that as we progress through this book. The chief eunuch, the official, gave them new names. They were all given new pagan names. Their Hebrew Jewishness was taken away. Names were changed as a way of encouraging them to forget the God and the traditions of their homeland and become conformed to the ways of the many gods of Babylon. It was a forced assimilation. Nebuchadnezzar wanted Daniel and his friends to conform to the pattern of this world, as we read in Romans 12:2. And a name change was one step towards that goal. To the Christian, the word repent means change of mind. Put to bad use, this becomes brainwashing, indoctrination, re-education. We could see this in the Nazis with the Hitler Youth Movement or what's happening in North Korea. So the boys' names were all changed. As we can see on this slide, all of their Jewish names were honoring God, and they were all changed to honor some of the pagan gods of Babylon. So let's get back to one of the items I mentioned a few moments ago. These boys were under the care of the chief eunuch. Most likely, it does not say in Daniel, but most likely these boys were made eunuchs. After Hezekiah showed the Babylonian envoy all the treasures of the kingdom of Judea, the prophet Isaiah warned him in Isaiah 39, 5-7. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord, and some of your descendants, some of your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So picture this. These young men were given their Hebrew, their Jewish names in Jerusalem at the temple when they were circumcised as 8 years old. And now they get new names as they're castrated as teenagers. So let's think about it as we celebrate Father's Day. Happy Father's Day, everybody, by the way. But I'm not sure about it. There are other men in here, but with this alone, I think I would have tapped out. Okay? But Daniel and his friends had to accept these changes and their names that previously proclaimed their allegiance to God. Nonetheless, Daniel and his colleagues embraced the challenge, secure in the belief that God would protect their faith and loyalty. Daniel and his friends were set in adverse circumstances, uncompromising conditions for the service of God. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity to these boys. The opportunity is to make a good life for themselves in a hostile land, and perhaps to bring God's power and justice to their new country. The prophet Jeremiah was urging the Jewish exiles to do just that in Jeremiah 29, where he said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in numbers there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord, for it is because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel." The challenge Daniel and his colleagues faced was forced assimilation at the expense of loyalty to God and their people. As Daniels of today, this is something we deal with on a daily or weekly basis, at work, in our communities, with our family and friends. Daniel and his friends could have viewed the Babylonians as their enemy. Instead, they adopted an attitude of learners and servants, trusting that God had a good plan and would protect and guide them through their studies. Daniel had friends, a band of friends. We all need a band of friends, a community of faith, like our men's group here at the Oaks, a band of friends we can lean on in our walk and to hold each other accountable as we stray. And when I say lean on our walk, it's not just because we're all getting old and we need help, walking. There is that too, though. The story continues. But Daniel purposed in his heart, underline that if you're taking notes, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused, we see that again, the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young man your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Interesting there, he refers to them in their Jewish names. "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this test and tested them for 10 days. So some of the takeaways here. First and foremost, Daniel purposed in his heart. He was determined, he was resolved, he made a conscious decision. He made a decision in the path that he would follow in life. He chose to follow God. We must all have a purpose and a desire, the outcome and the path that we will get you there. Now, if you don't have an outcome or desire, we could listen to Yogi Berra, right? When you come to a fork in the road, take it. It really doesn't matter which one you take. Or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here, asked Alice. That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, replied the cat. I don't much care where, asked Alice. Then it really doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. Or Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference. Could that road have been the narrow gate that we read about in Matthew? Or, of course, I had to squeeze this in because my wife wouldn't, how can you get a chance to stand up here and not mention your favorite band, my favorite band, the Canadian Rush band, from the album Free Will? So from this song, Free Will, you can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So here we see that choosing not to make the choice to follow God, you've still made a choice. I believe that Daniel's way of collaborating with his captors is an important part of the story too. Some Christians, when asked to do something against their conscience, either go along uncritically or else they take a confrontational stand that appears to make them holier than thou. Daniel found a third path, recognizing that his boss was sympathetic, again, under God's control there. He was sympathetic. If Daniel and his friends had lost their vitality due to the lower quality of food in the overseer's eyes, then vegetables and water, because vegetables and water seemed as an inferior food, his boss would have lost his life here. So to avoid putting the chief eunuch into a position where he would lose his life, Daniel asked for an evaluation, sort of a secret test from a lower guard, if you notice that in the reading. Give us 10 days, and if we're not healthier than the others, we'll relent and we'll follow your diet. So here, Daniel asked for permission, and he sought the favor of the local leaders. He didn't isolate himself. He built relationships with the king official, the guards, the commander of the king's guard, and eventually King Nebuchadnezzar, as well as King Belshazzar, Darius, and King Cyrus. Daniel respected their authority, but he didn't shy away from his faith. He knew that God was his ultimate authority. We might ask ourselves, who is our ultimate authority? Again, I refer to my Army Field Manual a second time. I looked up the cultural aspects of captivity and what do people go through when they're in POW. Cultural aspects. Observe the guards and others. Recognize the captor's cultural traits and utilize them to reduce harsh treatment. Recognize that other cultures have different worldviews. Can anyone think of anybody else in the Bible who was able to do this while in captivity and gain the friendship and respect of their guards? Joseph. So again, these boys were presented with an all-you-can-eat buffet. Teenagers gave up the best the king had to offer, meat and wine, and basically agreed to eat vegetable soup. Can any of you imagine doing this when you went to college? Can those with teenage boys in here imagine this happening in your house? I'm confident your grocery bill would go down. I know there were times when I was in college, I lived on ramen noodles, and surely know that I would have been hard-pressed to pass up a barbecue meal. So why did these boys refuse to eat the king's food? Cultural traditions surrounding diet were very strong to the Jews, whose food laws distinguished them sharply from their surrounding nations. We read that in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Perhaps they felt that keeping a separate diet would give Daniel and his friends a reminder of their allegiance to God. Perhaps it was to demonstrate that their physical condition depended on God's favor rather than on the king's dietary menu. Or perhaps it was to avoid eating the food that was most likely sacrificed to foreign pagan gods. We're not explicitly told the reasoning process, but regardless, he was determined not to defile himself by eating the food. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. These four young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds and literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. When Daniel and his companions came out of the test after 10 days, they were healthier than the others. This was not because eating a vegetarian diet will make you healthy in 10 days. It was, again, because God had his hand in this. As Brian Cole mentioned recently in the book of Matthew, don't necessarily run out and buy the Daniel diet book and expect you're going to have the same results. Let's just imagine for a moment if the guard then decided that everyone should be given Daniel's diet. What kind of a workplace challenge do you think these boys would have faced? Consider the workplace implications of your own actions. If you have the intestinal fortitude to push back on a program or a policy that you do not agree with, but you still want to do what's right. This sets the pattern for the remainder of the book. As time and time again, events display the superiority of Daniel's wisdom, and more importantly, the power of his God over the wisdom and the power of the unbelieving nations and their kings. Likewise, we need our students of today, to think beyond the curriculum they're being fed and seek insight from God about what they're actually learning. Christians in all kinds of workplaces face similarities to what Daniel and his friends experienced in the Babylonian Academy. There's no way to escape secular workplaces other than withdrawing from them and choosing to work in Christian-only institutions like churches and Christian schools. Many secular workplaces, but not all of them, offer a variety of opportunities for personal gain, such as good pay, job security, professional achievement and stature, comfortable working conditions, and interesting creative work. But we must ensure that we put in guardrails and face safeguards and pray to God for guidance and wisdom when confronted with ethical dilemmas in these environments. We can all try to actively associate with other Christians at work and form good relationships with non-believers in your workplace. It's also wise to adopt a modest lifestyle and not live beyond your means, so that your job and your career and your prestige and your need for money does not force you to do something contrary to God's commands just to keep up an extravagant way of living. We should avoid going into unnecessary debt for things that are genuinely wants and not needs. Trying to keep up the Joneses is a slippery, slippery slope. Also, Daniel reached out to others, and he formed that small band of believers and encouraged one another in faith to hold each other accountable. He had his band of friends. So what God was doing here was ensuring the small remnant that would return to Judah would be holy and know God. As we see later in the book, if you do your own studying this week, only a small number of the Israelites returned to Jerusalem after the 70 years. Boggles my mind, but go read it for yourself. And did you also notice how this section ended? Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Does this remind you of anybody else who could do this while in captivity? Joseph again. One last time, I promise, I pulled out my Army manual because I wanted to review the POW Code of Conduct. Article 4 of the Code of Conduct. And there's probably some in here I know that might be able to recite part of this. If I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. If I am senior, I will take command. If not, I will obey the lawful orders of those appointed over me and will back them up in every way. Sounds to Daniel like me. So either he was given a copy of the Code of Conduct, or maybe the Code of Conduct was written based upon Daniel's experiences. Bringing chapter 1 to a close. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into the service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every manner of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So 3 years later, it's graduation time. They get their interview with the big king, Nebuchadnezzar. And it was through the power of God, the king found them to be 10 times smarter than everyone else in their graduating class. They didn't just get participation trophies and ribbons. They were all valedictorians. Now, they had to share the valedictorian award probably, but they were all valedictorians. Chapter 1 ends again, as we see here, with all 4 of these young men being promoted into service in the king's court. So even though they pushed back, they held their values, they get promoted and rewarded for it. Now, we're not about to cover chapter 2. I'll leave that up to Brian someday. But for those that read chapter 2, as you remember, the king had a dream. The important takeaway I want you to get here is, in that dream, there was a statue, and the head was gold. And the head of gold represented Babylon. The rest of the metals in there represented the other nations, as you can see on the right of the slide here, that ultimately conquered each other, with the base of the stone being the rock, which would, all the nations would topple each other, but the rock at the bottom, God's kingdom, would prevail in the end for eternity. So the important part here, just remember, is it was a head of gold. So King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. The whole image was gold, not the head. 60 cubits high, 90 feet tall, and 6 cubits wide, 9 feet, and set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image of King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of the gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So after having this dream that was interpreted in chapter 2 by Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar proceeds to build a statue 90 feet tall of himself, made out of all gold. And I guess that was his way of defying what was told to him in the dream, that Babylon would be conquered. This has to be the definition of a massive ego complex. The scripture states that as soon as everyone heard the music, they must fall down and worship the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Again, the story continues. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. May your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the music, must fall down and worship the image of God, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown in the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews who you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my God or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made you, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into blazing fire. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So a rebel band of 3 friends did not comply with the decree to bow down. And you remember at this time, any decree the king put out could not be taken back. Once a decree was put out, he couldn't change his mind. Now the decree said that those that failed to bow down immediately would be thrown in the furnace. But the king didn't do so, probably because he valued these 3 young boys. He gives them a do-over. Or for those that golf, what is that? A mulligan. He gave them a mulligan, right? A second chance to comply here. And you have to appreciate his rhetorical question at the end. What God will be able to rescue from my hand? Well, let's find out. As the story continues. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to King Nebuchadnezzar, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers of the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them in the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, their trousers, their turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. So again, we see Daniel's band, his band of friends in action. They don't take the easy route and just bow down. Of course not. They again take a stand. They refuse to do so. They will continue to serve and trust in their God and refuse to worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar. Just like we all need to continually challenge ourselves to not take the easy way out and just choose the wide path. We need to set our sights in the path that will lead to the narrow gate. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar leaped his feet with amazement and asked his advisors, asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied and thrown into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and the royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So if you're like me, this image and the description of the fourth person in the fire is breathtaking. The takeaway is that even in tough times, trials, and tribulations, you're not alone. God's with you. Judy included a piece of this portion in today's bulletin. By the way, doesn't she do a good job on those? Amazing. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's commands and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who has anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be burned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. We would all agree with the king's statement here about our God, but we know it was all fluff for him because he reverted right back to his ways and continued to worship other deities. But notice here that this chapter ends the same way that chapter 1 and 2, if you read chapter 2, did, with a promotion. These 3 Israelites rise in prominence in the province of Babylon, and this move is confirmed of God's continued hand upon the faithful. Not only had God delivered them from the rage of the kings and the flames of the furnace, they were now in a better position in Babylon than they were before. So let's start to bring this close as we cover one of the most famous stories in Daniel. It pleased Darius, notice we're on to a new king here now. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule over the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Sound a little paranoid to me. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct in government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and the governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Couple takeaways here. The king planned to put Daniel in charge of the whole kingdom. But imagine what happened here. His co-workers were jealous and gossipy and vindictive. They tried to find a way to bring discredit to Daniel, but they could not come up with anything negative to say about him. Now, I'm sure this is not anything that would ever happen in any of the workplaces that any of you work in. We also see that they lied to the king when they said that all of the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors agreed that the king should issue an edict. Daniel was not included in the all, and the king might not have issued this edict without consulting with Daniel first, given how much he valued him, if he knew he was not part of that recommendation. A final note before we move on. You note that prayer was only prohibited for 30 days. Keep that in mind. 30 days they were told they couldn't pray. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asked God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human except you, your majesty, will be thrown in the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that in accordance to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So Daniel prayed in his chamber with his window open towards Jerusalem. This direction honored the words of Solomon in 1 Kings when he dedicated the newly built temple and said, if the Israelites were ever exiled from the promised land because of their flagrant disregard for God's commands, they were to pray towards Jerusalem and plead for heaven to hear and forgive to forgive and restore. That's in 1 Kings 8:44-47. Since the 70-year captivity was coming to an end, Daniel knew this from reading Scripture. Daniel was interceding on behalf of the Israelites, obeying King Solomon's instructions. King Darius may have issued an edict about prayer, but King Solomon's instructions were far more important, God-honoring and hope-giving. As we read in the last section, prayer was only prohibited for 30 days. Daniel could have easily just capitulated and not pray and then resume prayer in 30 days. Like, no big deal, right? I mean, come on, God, 30 days. But no, instead he risked death again, even knowing the end of his 70 years was so close and his exile would be over. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him in the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you've served continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? So we see here, Daniel was placed in a den where he was surely to die and not return, and a stone was placed over the mouth of it. Sound familiar? Any other story we've read? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. May God, my God, send his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They did not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave the order to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's commands, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language and all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the powers of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we see here that Daniel was, of course, expected to be killed by the lions, but he was lifted out of the den from death because he trusted in God. Again, does this sound familiar? And in case you missed it along the way, at the time of the story, Daniel is 80 years old. He continued to be faithful to God the whole time he was in captivity. He's now an old man. He's not the young child that's often portrayed in the children's versions of this story. In total, Daniel survived and outlasted and served 4 kings: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and King Cyrus, trusting in our sovereign Lord the whole time. So I pondered what verses of Scripture Daniel might have written on the wall next to his window as he looked out and prayed, and I selected 3. Mark 12:30. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. 1 Corinthians 15:33. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. And Isaiah 43:1. But now, this is what the Lord says. He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. And in closing this chapter again, we see the repeating theme we've seen in the other chapters. Daniel was promoted to chief of staff, the chief governor over all of Babylon. So to wrap this all up, what can we glean from these stories? What can we learn from Daniel's friends? I pulled this list of principles and lessons together from a variety of commentaries that I read on the book of Daniel. I picked the ones that hit home for me. I'm not going to read them all to you. I'll let you scan the list for a moment. If anybody wants a copy, see me after the service. I'll be glad to email this to you. But as we get ready to sing our closing song, that's the cue to my team to start coming up. We're going to sing a song you might recall singing as a child. And I challenge each of you to dare to be a Daniel, to dare to stand alone. Pay close attention to these words as you sing it, and I hope that the words stick in your head all week. My wife is sick of me singing this in the shower every morning, so she'll be glad.